As we've been discussing, it's an absolute abomination and a shame of the United States of America that our president is doing a drive-by touchdown in Anchorage, Alaska. He could have certainly preempted his trip. He's the leader of the free world. He could have determined that it was important for him to be on the East Coast, in Manhattan, in Shanksville, in Washington, D.C. for September 11th. But no, it was more important for him to be in Asia at the G20 summit. I would think that the G20 would accommodate our schedule if necessary. They have in the past. So why was it so important for him to be there? Why was it so important for him to embarrass our nation in Vietnam? Let's bring in Peter Schweizer. Peter Schweizer, of course, from the Government Accountability Institute. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you as always, Larry. Thanks for having me.
Am I overstepping here? I mean, I know that it's important for us to attend the G20, but boy, it sure looked like a whole lot of kowtowing to Vietnam, and let's face it, they're kind of still a proxy for China, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was a pretty disastrous trip. Not only did he fail to exhibit strength, which is what the world is looking for right now with China's rising power, he's trying to create the impression that somehow greater diplomatic ties with Vietnam are going to really amount to anything in the equation. They're not. And to your point about 9/11, look, history and the symbolism behind history and the tragedy of what happened is extremely important. And this president, unfortunately, has a habit of minimizing American history. And I think that is a tragedy as well in terms of the morale that we see around the country.
I've seen a lot of headlines and analysis saying, well, Vietnam is the alternative for American manufacturing if we need to and we should pull out of manufacturing in China. Vietnam is a viable alternative. Is it really, or is it more of the same problem there? Vietnam isn't really able to do anything robustly economic without China's approval, right? Or you tell me.
Well, I mean, Vietnam does have some independence, but I don't think they have the population base. It is still basically a communist country. The better alternative, of course, is India, which for all of its flaws, its problems with corruption, is actually a democratic system, sees China as a rival threat. But again, I think there's too much overthinking here because India has these historic ties to Russia. There's the reluctance of this administration to partner with anybody that seems to be remotely pro-Russian. I think the natural ally for manufacturing for us is India, or bring it even closer to home in the United States. If you can't compete with producing it in the United States, maybe Mexico or someplace closer. But yeah, Vietnam strikes me as kind of far afield as far as these issues are concerned.
And also, I mean, considering the fact that the G20 summit was in India, and most analysts say that India, as you just said, is really the natural alternative there. Given that in Asia and in the subcontinent, saving face and protecting face is such an important part of the culture, especially business culture, isn't it kind of interpreted as insulting for him to fly off from G20 in India and touch down in Vietnam and say, oh, by the way, what can we do here, guys?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of overly gracious language towards Vietnam. There are lots of issues and a lot of problems. And this is what you get a lot of times from the diplomatic corps. They think that, oh, we're going to sign some sort of diplomatic agreement with Vietnam, and that represents something important. In this case, I really doubt that it does. And I do think it shows the kind of strategic confusion right now we're seeing from this administration. The fact of the matter is China is the threat. Joe Biden doesn't even want to say that. He even continues to insist, as he did at the G20, that China is not a threat. We're not trying to contain them. Well, if we're not trying to contain them, then what are we trying to do with regard to them? And that's what I think part of the problem is, the confusion at the top.
If we could shift our focus now to the corruption of the Biden family, his son and his brother, of course, engaging in corrupt business practices that are being investigated by the Justice Department. I keep seeing this message coming out of the Biden administration and also from foreign policy experts in this town, Peter Schweizer, that in acting to threaten the government of Ukraine to oust that prosecutor who was investigating Burisma, the company that was paying his son so much money and maybe even paying Joe Biden himself so much money, that all he was doing was carrying out not just the policy of the United States, but also the policy of all of our allies in Europe. All the countries in Europe wanted this guy, this investigator in Ukraine, gone. Is that true? That's the first I've heard it.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely not true. In fact, there's been some very good reporting coming out with Freedom of Information Act request documents that have been released, John Solomon and others have been reporting on. That was not the consensus. In fact, the U.S. State Department's position was that that prosecutor was actually doing a good job in the corruption-laden country of Ukraine. So again, this is more misinformation from this administration. They keep shifting the goalposts. You know, they continue to say, well, look, you haven't shown any money at all is coming to Joe Biden, so this is a non-issue. No. If you look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is federal law, if you look at the international bribery standards that the Obama-Biden administration signed on to in 2011, it's bribery whether you pay a family member or whether you pay the politician themselves. So that is not a defense for the Bidens, and they continue to shift the goalposts because they know that the walls are closing in.
Yeah, and Peter, it is I did a monologue about this on the show last week. It is remarkable that their prime defense is, oh, sure, he may have done stuff that got his son and his brother rich, but if he didn't get rich, it's okay. How is that okay? That's still unethical, inappropriate, and probably illegal.
Yeah, no, that's right. And this is the problem. And I think the reason that you see a lot of Democrats nervous, you see it in the polling. CNN just had a poll. 61% of the American people believe that Joe Biden acted inappropriately as it relates to his son's business dealings while he was vice president of the United States. But also among senior Democrats, they worry about his age, but they also worry about where this story is going. Because remember, Joe Biden has continually to reassure over the 5 years this has been a story. First it was he didn't know about the business deals. Then it became he did not meet with any of his business partners. Then it became he was not a participant. Each one of those has turned out to be completely false. They've lied repeatedly. And the question I think senior Democrats are asking is, if there's nothing here, why do you keep lying about it? Why do you keep shifting the goalposts? So a lot of nervous, I think, among senior Democrats about where the story is going. The investigation is just getting started. There's a lot more that's going to be coming out.
So at what point, Peter Schweizer, did one of those senior Democrats actually utter it out loud? You're right. It's being whispered backstage here in Washington, D.C. You hear it all the time. People are sort of winking and nodding and saying, oh, yeah, there's some real nervous senators over there on Capitol Hill. And there's a lot of nervous, big money Democrat donors who are afraid of putting too much money into the Biden reelection effort if it dries up, if there's not going to be a Biden reelection effort. So when does push come to shove here?
Well, I think a lot of that's taking place behind closed doors. And I think what they're going to try to do is use the age issue to essentially say, you know, look, he's going to stay in office, but he's not going to seek re-election. And then they're hoping that the investigation stuff kind of just goes away, that people lose interest. I think that's a mistake. For me, it's always been about more than just Joe Biden. It's about this large question, Larry, which is, do we want senior politicians in the United States for their family members to be doing deals with foreign countries and their politician, family members taking actions that benefit those clients? That's a hugely terrible thing to happen to our country. And so I think whether Joe Biden seeks re-election or not, this investigation needs to continue. And I think that's the sentiment on Capitol Hill as well.
Well, amen to that. And I've been trying to say this, Peter Schweizer, and it's because I know this because I read your book, Red-Handed, How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win. Because one of the big scandals of this whole Biden affair may be that so much of it is actually legal. Everyone says, oh, well, he didn't break the law. That's the problem. How is so much of this legal?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of things that if Joe Biden had been doing as a CEO of a company, self-dealing, et cetera, he would face serious legal sanction from the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example. But as a politician, he's free to do it. So that is one of the issues. I do think also in this particular case, we do have a lot of evidence that points to actual illegality.
Yes.
I mean, you have essentially Hunter Biden's business partners saying they, meaning Hunter and his business partners from Ukraine, called the father to get the prosecutor fired. Hunter was being paid at the time to essentially do that based on the emails. And then you have Joe Biden bragging that he was the one that threatened to withhold U.S. aid to get the prosecutor fired. That is as close as a quid pro quo as you're going to get, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to corruption. If that is not illegal under federal law, then I would say basically nothing is illegal.
Right.
Unless you, in front of cameras, are going to take a bunch of cash payments and say on an audible microphone what exactly you're going to do.
Peter Schweizer, the Government Accountability Institute. Thanks for joining us. It's O'Connor tonight on Salem News Channel.